Hi, my name is Jillian Vestal. I really appreciate all of you being here and making some time to talk this evening and to discuss a bit about contracts and um, internal medicine compensation trends and how we're seeing things sort of shape up in 2026. We are going to, and just quickly, can everybody see my screen? We're going to talk a bit about what we're seeing again in compensation trends for internal medicine. We're going to talk about things that we see in contracts and how to navigate those. A couple of housekeeping items that I want to mention just before we get too far into our conversation tonight. There are going to be a couple of polls that come up on the screen throughout our time together. So we would love for you to interact with those to hear a little bit more from you and understand kind of where you are and get some feedback. There is also going to be a promo code that is going to come up later at the end of um, the at the end of here we go at the end of the webinar tonight, and it is going to offer you a discount on our services. So please stick around until the end, and we're going to do our best to keep you engaged throughout that time. But at the end, we'll give you that promo code and would love to have the opportunity to work with you on your contract. So we'll go ahead and jump in. So the first thing that I think is really important to talk about is why this conversation matters. Um, Beyond just the importance of knowing what's in a document when you sign it, um, it's also really important, of course, to understand why this discussion is worthwhile. More than half of US physicians report experiencing burnout at some point in their career. When they're asked why, the causes that they report are lack of autonomy, the expectations that their employer has are unrealistic, and then the workloads and clerical burdens are just onerous. They're just really heavy. They are more than is realistic, and frankly, probably more than they expected. Now, we can't present or prevent rather all of that, but through a good contract review and negotiation, we can address a lot of that. Even if we're not able to remove all of those issues, we can hopefully identify the potential concerns and help the doctor understand what's coming and hopefully find ways to make adjustments around that. So, what we're doing is more than just about the piece of paper that you're signing. It's really about your overall well being, your overall work life balance, and your general kind of happiness. So, again, who are we? So, Panacea Legal is a law firm that is focused on doctor employment contracts. We offer a transparent flat cost. So you're not going to get billed later for each email we send and for each phone call we answer. You have 1 year follow-ups, meaning you can come back to us. We'll answer any other questions you have. You get to talk with the person that you worked with. There's no, limit on that. And we have a really good understanding of the market. So we're not just going to talk about, hey, this is what the legal terms mean, but we're also going to say, hey, this is what we're seeing in the market, and this is how we feel like your contract compares. I am a licensed attorney. This says 1,500, I think. I'm well over 2,000 at this point, but I've reviewed quite a few contracts at this point across all specialties, all practice types. My goal is to help doctors make their best decision. So sometimes, frankly, that means walking away. Sometimes it means making some tough decisions and asking some tough questions. But the goal is always for um, doctors to know what they're getting, to understand their contract better. So tonight we're going to talk about understanding the basics in your contract, knowing the questions to ask about your contract and how to ask them, and then the question that I get most of all, how to identify red flags when you're looking at your contract. So again, we're going to talk about those basic components. We're going to talk about the areas that present the biggest um, risks, and then looking out for those red flags. So starting with the contract components, these are the things that you need to be um, aware of, the things that you need to be mindful of as you're getting your agreement, whether it's your first one or your fifth one. So most contracts are going to have at least these sections. Now, for those of you who've seen multiple agreements, you know that all contracts are going to be different. You may get one agreement that's 5 pages and another that's 40 pages. And the reality is they all may be okay. There are things that really need to be there. I would say this list really needs to be addressed. We can go into a lot of other things too, right? We can have a lot of other contingencies, right? If this happens, we'll do this. If that happens, we'll do that. We can go into a lot of regulatory issues, right? This is how we're going to comply with these particular things. These issues, to me, are the things that you want to be sure you're addressing. So we want to know how long the contract's going to last. When does it renew? How does it renew? If you want out of the contract, how do you get out of the contract? When can you get out of the contract? How can they end the contract? All of those timing issues we want to understand. We also want to know what your duties are. What is this schedule going to be? Where are you going to work? Especially if you're going to work for an employer that has multiple locations, being certain about which location you'll be at is really important. Understanding if you'll be responsible for any call um, is also important. And knowing any supervisory responsibilities, any leadership, things like that also certainly matter. You also really want to know what your compensation structure is going to be, of course. We want to know what you're going to be paid, and we want to know what that's based on. And we're going to talk in a bit about what compensation structures look like and what those things can be based on. We want to know if there are bonus opportunities, and we want to know also what that's based on. We want to understand if recruitment incentives are being offered. If so, how are those paid? When are those paid? Do they have any repayment options that are going to be required? So all of those things matter. All of those things are going to be important, and all of those things should be laid out in the contract. Now, consistent with that, we want to know the benefits. We want to know when you'll be eligible for benefits, assuming that you are. We want to know what's offered. Very, very typical language that you'll see is that you, again, assuming you are employed, is that you're going to have the same benefits as similarly situated employees, meaning you'll have what other doctors have, right? And that's common. And often that seems great, right? We go, well, yeah, that seems fair. And if you're going to go work for a large health system or you're going to work for an academic institution, those things are good. They typically have robust benefits. That's great. I reviewed a contract recently, and the doctor was going to work for a relatively small private practice, and the language said just that. Okay. So I said, let's ask what those benefits are. So we did that, and we found out there were no benefits. The contract said you'll get what everybody else has, and the answer was nobody else had anything either. So that is, oh, my apologies. So that is something that we want to be mindful of. So don't just sort of take what's on face value. Let's dig a little bit deeper. We also want to know about liability. Who's going to pay for malpractice insurance and who's going to pay for tail coverage? Those things should be included in the contract. It should be clear there who's going to be responsible for the cost. Indemnification is kind of a one of those issues that comes up a lot. If you Google, things to watch out for in a doctor contract, this is a word that you're going to see. And I think a lot of people don't have a great understanding of it, frankly. And I think it's kind of used as it's a bit of a scary thing. So, what indemnification means is let's say you and I are going to go into business together and we say we'll indemnify each other. That means I'm not going to hold you responsible for my actions, and you won't hold me responsible for yours. So, again, on its face, it seems pretty fair. The problem is sometimes when there are two entities working together, their actions are pretty tied together. And so, well, your actions were a result of my actions, which were a result of your action, right? And everybody's sort of built on top of one another. And so it's really difficult um, to exact liability in that way. So, clauses, indemnification clauses that we want to be really cautious about are ones that say, you, the doctor, will indemnify your employer for everything, which means they will never have any liability for something that you do. So, any lawsuit, any cost, any liability from your actions will be your responsibility. So, if there's a lawsuit, um, let's say it's a malpractice lawsuit, let's say it's not. Let's say that you hit somebody in the parking lot with your car and that person sues you and sues the hospital. You would be the one financially responsible, not the hospital. What I like to see in indemnification is if we can limit it to circumstances that say you, the doctor, will indemnify them in situations where you have acted intentionally, where you have acted fraudulently, um, where you have acted criminally, right? So if you are convicted of false billing for Medicaid, or you lied in your credentialing and you never went to med school, yeah, that's all on you, right? The employer's not going to be responsible for that. But just for the everyday things that you very much did as an employee of theirs, there's going to be some shared liability. So, again, that's one of those clauses that, we want to read really carefully. Um, don't be, seeing the word there in and of itself is not problematic, but again, we want to know what it says. And then the other thing that we just have so much about kind of that we hear so much about and that there is so much buzz about are restrictive covenants. And of course, non-competes are the one that really gets the most attention. And that is a covenant that is going to have a time component and a geographic component. It's going to say, while you're here and for a year after, you can't work within 10 miles of the practice, the location, whatever. So I'll answer the first question. At a federal level, non-competes are still very much enforceable. The previous administration had issued a rule that was immediately challenged that would have done away with non-competes. The current administration kind of rescinded that, chose not to continue trying to enforce that, though they have indicated that maybe they're looking at a rule that would do away with non-competes for healthcare providers. So we'll see. A lot of states have implemented some restrictions about non-competes for healthcare providers. So certainly be aware of what, is happening in your state. Um, Even in states where they are technically allowable, a lot of judges choose not to, well, a lot of judges are hesitant to enforce them. From a policy standpoint, we talk a lot about access to care. We talk a lot about, the need for more providers. And so it does go against that logic, right? To say, well, we um, we need more providers, but we're going to keep some from being able to work in certain areas. That being said, in my experience, when you have a non-compete in a contract, an employer is going to hold on to that pretty tightly. So if you just come in and say, "Hey, look, I want this taken out," um, that's going to be a challenge. What I think is a really great alternative is finding ways to differentiate um, your practice from what you may want to do. And internal medicine is actually a really, really great um, area in which to do that. So if you're going to be in a hospitalist position, which, side note, I think having a non-compete in a hospitalist position makes no sense at all anyway, but you still see them. So if you're going to go work as a hospitalist, um, let's see if we can get them to agree to language that says you won't work as a hospitalist within a certain radius, which would allow you to go work, of course, in an outpatient setting, and vice versa. If you're working as in primary care, would they allow you to work as a hospitalist? Those can be really, really good alternatives. Practice settings also matter too. If you're going to go work at a community health center, would they allow you to go work at an academic facility? Things like that where we can say, hey, where I am now is really different than this other place that would consider going. Um, I think you're going to have a lot more luck there than just saying like, hey, please take this out. Um, Non-solicitations are actually, let me back up. One more thing about non-competes. The other thing to watch for too is often they'll be from multiple locations. So they may say from all of our locations. Well, if it's a large health center with 10 facilities, that could be much more problematic. So if it's possible to limit it to one location or to just your primary location or the one location you worked at, that's certainly better too. So that is the other thing that, you know, to be mindful of and to try to negotiate if it's multiple. Non-solicitations are going to be restrictions against soliciting patients, employees. Now, again, if you're working as a hospitalist, soliciting patients is kind of a moot point, right? You're not building a panel that you're going to try to take with you to the next clinic. Um, if you're working in an outpatient setting, that's sort of a different scenario. I don't mind a non-solicitation that says, hey, you can't actively try to pull patients with you. I do mind a non-solicitation that says, if the patient comes to you, you can't see them, because that really restricts the patient's right more than it does yours. So this is really a matter of degrees. Um, some non-solicitations I think are okay, and then I think some obviously go too far. And exclusivity is going to be kind of similar to a non-compete, but it's going to say, hey, while you're working here, we don't want you to do outside work. Now, often there's not even a geographic restriction. It's just like, we don't want you to do it. Now, again, if you're working a traditional hospitalist shift and you have some built-in time blocks where you could do that, it doesn't make a ton of sense. You're still often going to see it. Most of the time in that scenario, they're not going to have a huge issue with you doing it, but they are going to want you to run it by them. So be mindful of that and be mindful that those are two separate clauses, um, especially in states where we don't allow non-competes. They will often still allow an exclusivity agreement. So they may not be able to tell you what what your limitations are after you leave, but they can still limit you while you're there. So those are the things you want to be mindful of. So looking at all of these components, which ones potentially are the most problematic? Certainly compensation, understanding your risks as it relates to the exit strategy, and then well defining your duties. What does this job actually look like? So those are kind of the areas where we're going to talk next. So, of course, assessing your compensation. We have Dr. Jones here who signed a contract. He's making $250,000. He's happy. Starting his second year, his compensation has gone way down. He has no idea why. Of course, he is not happy. So the problem here is that he did not understand the the compensation structure that he signed. He may have relied on assumptions, on things he'd been told, things he heard. He didn't know the structure. He likely didn't know the right questions to ask about the structure. So when we're looking at um, compensation structure, in my experience, compensation structures are going to fall into one of these four categories. Now, there may be hybrids. There may be situations where you have um, parts of contracts that are, um, paid in one way and another part in another. So there are certainly things to consider, but these are what you typically see. So the first is going to be a flat rate. So this is not going to be dependent upon any particular metric. It's just going to be a rate. Um, Usually, in this situation, it's going to be monthly or annually. Um, you typically only see this for a short period of time. Maybe it's guaranteed for a year or two, but you don't usually see it too much longer than that. Um, Often you'll see after that a guarantee plus production. And that's going to be a flat salary with the ability to earn more. Um, the salary may be a little bit lower, so you may have less guarantee with the ability to earn more. I would say that that is probably um, what I see most frequently in a clinic-based setting. If you're working for a hospital, if you're working for an academic institution, something like that. Um, Productivity bonuses can be based on panel size, based on collections. They can be based on RVUs or patient encountered, I mean, any number of things there. And certainly in primary care, we see all of those as options. Collections are going to be relevant in um, private practices more often. WRVUs are going to be in hospital and academics, health systems. And then patient encounters and patient panel size are going to be in uh, capitated models as well as, FQHC settings like that. So again, it kind of depends on the setting that you're going to be in um, to determine kind of what that bonus may look like. Now, there's also just a production only where you have no guarantee, but you essentially have kind of that same model as the productivity bonus. You just don't have that flat rate. So instead of saying, hey, once you hit a certain threshold, you get this bonus, it's just, hey, from day one, you're paid this much per RVU or this much for your panel size. Obviously, there's a lot more risk involved in that. We often see it in 1099 positions, independent practices, again, in private practice settings. It's also pretty typical with these first three that you may start in one and transition to the next. So you may start at a guarantee and transition to a guarantee plus production. You may also start at a guarantee plus production and transition to production only. So it may be that you have a floor essentially to begin as your practice building, and then at some point, at least part of your compensation becomes much more dependent upon your productivity. So again, all of these I would say tend to be utilized more in an outpatient setting. The fourth option is sort of the outlier in that it doesn't kind of have that similar vein as or the similar methodology as the first three, and that's the time based. So this is going to be where you have a rate based on hours or shifts. Um, Obviously, hospitalists uh, are often paid using this. Emergency medicine, urgent care, um, those types of um, settings are where you see this a lot. Now, there may be, again, where we talked about kind of hybrid. So you may see a time-based plus a production bonus. That's possible too. I will say here that um, I don't personally like to see a hospitalist compensation package that is too reliant on WRVUs. Um, when you're in a hospitalist setting, you just don't have the opportunity to control your volume. Not that you're completely in control of it in an outpatient setting, but you do have more control than you do as a hospitalist. Um, so if they want to offer that as a bonus, great. If they're telling you, like, well, we pay this lower shift rate because the WRVU bonus would make up the difference, I would really dig into that and ask some questions. Um, the questions that I would ask certainly are, what their volumes tend to look like, what their patient census looks like, what happens in the months where the census is lighter. I would also ask if it is an open or a closed ICU. If it's an open ICU that the hospitalists are covering, then the WRVU numbers tend to be increased from a situation where it's a closed ICU that hospitalists are not covering. So, understanding what that looks like, but I just always want to be cautious about getting in a situation where, again, your compensation is too reliant upon something that is outside of your control. The other thing to note too, and this is something that nobody really enjoys, but when you see a rate-based or time-based compensation, regardless of the specialty, that is often going to be kind of a department-wide number. So this is what we pay per hour. This is what we pay per um, shift. You will likely see a night shift differential. You may see where the RVU bonus instead of a large number, but you get $3 extra per hour, or the quality bonus is $5 extra per shift or per hour, something like that. Um, but it's typically going to start at the same base rate. So, um, again, that can sometimes be a challenge to overcome, but frequently that's going to be the case. So, negotiating a higher rate may be a challenge, just something to keep in mind. So, looking at these, we've kind of assessed, okay, here's the compensation structure. Obviously that, this doesn't tell us, well, are the numbers good? Are the numbers where they should be? So, some of you may be familiar with the MGMA data. It's a source that comes out each year with, it's a survey rather that comes out each year. It's used as a resource by a lot of employers with data about what doctors are paid. So looking at this data, oh, sorry, we have some. So these are additional opportunities here. So other things to ask about, are you going to be taking on any administrative roles? Are there, you know, quality initiatives? Are you going to be working with students or residents? Are you going to be supervising APPs? Understanding the type of practice, understanding where the practice is, um, how badly do they need someone to be in that practice? How long have they been recruiting? All of those things really factor in to a conversation about compensation. So those are also good things to understand in that. So talking about the MGMA data, this is data that you're going to see used frequently. And so the things that I think it's really important to understand is what the data means and what the data tells us. So we will often look to the total compensation. That's a number that you'll hear a lot. The MGMA defines that as all of the cash compensation that you'll receive. It's important to note that that does not include any valuation of benefits. It's important to note that because often you're going to get a worksheet. Maybe you get it with an LOI, maybe it's at the end of a contract, and they're going to have this big number at the bottom, and then they're going to have all of these kind of line items telling you how they got to this total, um, the total package. And in there, they're going to have the valuation of benefits. And those benefits absolutely have value. And I absolutely want you to have those things. However, they are not included in the MGMA's calculation. So if they're telling you, like, no, look, see, we're offering the same because our number and the MGMA's number is the same, but their number includes retirement benefits, then they're not the same. So just something to note there. The data is also going to include RVU thresholds, patient encounters. So any of those things that you may have for bonus thresholds, any relevant information, that's also going to be available. So understand that that is there too. Also understand that when we're talking about internal medicine, we are going to be able to divide that data out into outpatient versus hospitalist. So we can get data that's specific. The data can also be filtered based on the population size, based on what experience you have. So we can determine kind of what's going to be relevant for you. Now, the data is most frequently filtered by region. And there are 4 regions in the country. So there's going to be variation, 50 states within 4 regions, there's still a lot of variation. So we want to know, kind of where you are within that. Now, the data is never going to be able to account for the specifics of each position. Again, as I said, if they've been recruiting for a position for 2 years, the data is not going to tell you that, right? If you were going to a very rural area that is really in need of primary care physicians, the data is not going to account for that. The other assumption that the data makes is that we are looking at full time. And when we're talking about primary care, that is relatively similar to define in an outpatient setting, of course, right? 40 hours a week, we kind of know what that looks like. And that may vary a bit, right? For some people, it may be 32 patient facing hours, others may be 36, but there's not going to be quite as much variance. Um, you're going to see more variance in a hospitalist setting. So the MGMA data is going to be that large total comp number. As I told you earlier, hospitalists are often paid by the shift or by the hour. We're going to have to do our own math because they're not going to tell us the median is X and that's based on a median number of hours of this, right? So we are making some assumptions there. The data, of course, is not perfect, but it can be a really useful tool. So these are some things to keep in mind when looking at that, when using that tool, that I think, I know this is not something that is necessarily presented to doctors, so it's something that I want to make sure you have an understanding of, um, because I think it's something that you, if you haven't already, something that you will run into. So looking then at internal medicine total compensation. So again, total cash compensation. These are the last 4 years in terms of what we're seeing from the MGMA data. You can see that there was a pretty significant leap from 21 to 22, and then steady growth from the years since. So each year the MGMA data report comes out. So the 2025 report was the 2024 data. In May, we'll get the 2026 report with 2025. So the thing that I would note here with that 2021 data, I think 2020 and 2021 obviously were very odd years. So I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in the 21 numbers and that jump there. I think that the consistency with the other 3 years is probably the most telling and the most accurate. So these numbers are based on the number of years in practice. Again, steady growth. It's interesting because some specialties don't show this. Some kind of have a peak somewhere in the middle and then start to taper off a bit. And these numbers are certainly not to show you, that this is where you have to be. These are numbers that are not filtered. So, you know, take these all kind of as interesting data points, not necessarily as prescriptive, but also as indicative of the kind of data that's available. Um, and then this information is for starting. So it's for people coming right out of training, guaranteed compensation, plus the relocation in the lighter blue, and then signing bonus in the gray. So this number is a little bit different. It's not the guaranteed comp. It is, or it's not the total comp. It is guaranteed comp. So questions that I get a lot are like, should I ask for more money? I think there are a lot of questions to ask before before you say, hey, should I ask for more? Understanding when the structure last changed, especially if you're in that hospitalist setting, like I said, that's often going to be the same for everybody. If that stayed the same for the last 5 or 6 years, you've just seen from that data how much those numbers have changed. Knowing if everybody is paid based on the same structure. If not, then you may have more room. Knowing if there are quality metrics, how those are determined, digging into that more. Again, knowing when that structure is going to be looked at again, knowing if you'll be compensated for call, um, what that looks like, how that works. If you take on more, if you do if you lead a quality initiative, is there compensation there? If you supervise APPs, is there compensation? When are bonuses paid out? You want them paid out, as frequently as possible, but you also want to know when so that if you're planning to leave, you don't leave money on the table. When do you become eligible for more? Sometimes, there is a tiered structure, especially in academics, that, at this time interval, you have that ability. So we want to know what that looks like. Are there additional recruitment incentives? Are you maximizing signing bonus? Can you get additional, um, student loan forgiveness, things like that? So, again, a lot of questions to ask that are more specific and more helpful, I think, than just, hey, can I have more money? Um, there's a lot more to a compensation structure than just a singular number. So, getting more specific and more drilled down, I think is going to yield a better answer. So we're going to talk about a couple of other sections. We're not going to spend near as much time there, so don't worry about that. I appreciate y'all sticking with us, and don't forget we do have that code at the end. So please, uh, please stick with us. So we have Dr. Singh, who became employed where she trained. It's been a couple of years and she's ready to move on. She's not really sure how to do that. So the problem here is that she really needed to negotiate that compensation or that exit strategy um, at the beginning. She needs to know what her options are. She needs to know how to handle termination, what to do with tail coverage, and what the non-compete clause says. So the most frequent option for termination is going to be without cause. That's going to mean that nobody's really done anything wrong, even if that means they're not really that great and um, you've had some friction there. By not doing anything wrong, I mean nobody's breached the contract, right? Nobody's done anything that rises to that level. Typically, there's going to be a notice requirement. 90 days is what's most frequent. The thing that I look for here is mutual time frame. So if they're going to require you to give 90 days, I want them to give you 90 days as well. I've seen contracts that say you give us 180 days, we'll give you 15 days. Well, that's not not what we want, obviously. You also want to be aware of mandatory timeframes. So it may say you can terminate with 90 days notice after the first 3 years or, after the first year or something like that. You want to make sure that you're okay with whatever that timeline is. A for cause termination is going to mean someone's done something wrong. Somebody has violated the contract. If you feel like you're in that circumstance on either side of it, I would encourage you to contact an attorney. You can certainly reach out and we'll help kind of get you in the right direction. That can be a really serious circumstance that can affect you kind of moving forward. So it's not something that we see a lot. It's certainly not something um, to take lightly if you're being terminated for cause. So know what your rights are there. And like I said, I would obtain counsel. So after determining, okay, this is how I can get out of it, you want to know who's going to pay for tail coverage. Ideally, of course, that's going to be the employer. Um, I see that a fair amount of time. It's more common with academics. They almost always pay for tail. Um, Hospital systems, healthcare systems, they do frequently. Sometimes it's going to be tied to the reason the contract ended. Sometimes it's going to be tied to how long you've been there. So for every year, they'll pay for 20%, something like that. But you want that laid out and you want to negotiate that before you sign. We've talked about the non-compete, of course. You want to know what that is. You want to negotiate that before you sign as well. Um, I've had some people say, like, well, I'll just negotiate this when I want to leave. There is no, you have no leverage. They have no reason to, they have no reason to do that, right? They don't have any reason to engage at that point. So I would certainly say, do your best to get that to a place that's workable on the front end. And then again, if you've gotten those recruitment incentives, understand what repayment would look like, understand how long you need to stick around. Um, you know, Again, they may be tied to the reason the contract ended as well. If we can prorate those over the number of months, so instead of just an all or nothing, that's also a great thing. But we want to pay attention to what those look like. So we also, of course, want to know everybody's expectations. So Dr. Wynn here joined a group. Everybody has Fridays off, but she gets her schedule and she's working Friday, but she's got Wednesday off, and she does not like that. Um, she made some assumptions. She relied kind of on what she had seen and heard. She did not understand the specific expectations. She didn't ask the right questions around kind of what was going on. Um, so asking about the schedule and the location is really important. Language that I love to see relative to those two is that both of those will be mutually agreed upon. So they can't tell you just, hey, this is where you're going to work and when you're going to work, but rather they will say those things will be based on what we both agree to. If you want specific details written in, I think that's also great. Just getting a definition of full time is really helpful, which I know seems a little bit basic, but even as we say that, okay, if it's 40 hours, well, how much of that is patient facing? If it's full time as a hospitalist, what does that mean? Do you get any time off as a hospitalist? How much time do you get for CME in any of these positions? If you're outpatient and you have 40 hours a week, is that a 4-day work week? Are there any weekend shifts required of you? I mean, all of those things are part of that discussion. And so I think as much detail as we can get, the better. Call is something else that I would say probably in this particular specialty comes up a bit less, but understanding what that's going to look like. Are there maximums that they're willing to put into the contract? Whenever we see that call will be equal or it will be equitable, understand that that number can rotate, right? If there are 10 people in the group now, it may be reasonable. If half the group leaves, then that means your call has doubled. So just understanding of what that looks like. Volume is not something that I really anticipate being in the contract, but I do think it's an important conversation to have. I say that with this caveat. There are times in hospitalist contracts that I do see a bonus that if your daily patient panel is over a certain number, if your patient encounters is over a certain number, then you'll get a bonus. So occasionally that will be there. Otherwise, it's typically not in a contract. But again, you certainly want to know what their expectations are. So these are some great questions to ask around their expectations to understand what they want this position to look like, how they would measure success in this position and for you. I don't expect these answers to be written in, but I do think that they're great ways to start conversations here. So the last section we'll talk through is red flags. And I know that everybody wants me to have kind of a list of like, these are the words that if you see them, turn and run. Unfortunately, I don't. The thing that I would say is the biggest red flag is just a lack of transparency. If the contract does not provide a lot of detail, and when we ask for detail, they won't even have a conversation relative to that. If the contract gives them all of the control, right, they'll determine when you work and where you work, and it doesn't even really say what you're going to be paid. If they're telling you, hey, we're going to give you this signing bonus, but we're just not really going to write it down. Those kinds of things are certainly concerning. And then situations where you're taking on all the risk, right? You're paying for malpractice, you're paying for tail, you're indemnifying them, you've got a huge restrictive covenant, all of those things where the risk is all yours and they've got all the control, that's certainly another big red flag. The reality is that just like a contract needs to be specific, the red flags are going to be specific too. Um, I spoke with the doctor earlier today. He was going to be in a particular area because his spouse was completing her residency in that area. Once that was finished, they planned to move out of the area. The non-compete was not a factor for him. So what might have been a red flag for someone was not for him. So again, particular terms are really hard to just definitively say this is a problem. Um, it's more about kind of the tone and the interactions. And so again, that lack of transparency is really the thing that I see as the most problematic. So we've talked through compensation structures. We've talked about things that you want to be aware of specific to the end of your contract and getting out of the contract with as few penalties as possible, and understanding what success looks like within the contract. I really appreciate you being here today. Um, there is a promo code here at the bottom. It is IMComp20, and you can sign up for our contract review services and receive 20% off if you enter that code. Our website is here on the screen, as well as my email address if you have any questions. Um, there is also in the chat a link, I believe, to our website and to my email address. Um, I'm happy to answer questions here if anybody has any. Um, or, like I said, you can sign up for a free consultation or reach out to me directly. Okay. If there are no questions, we will go ahead and wrap up for tonight. Again, please feel free to reach out, and I hope to talk with you all soon. Thank you.